All research for this project was completed using the Graham W. Jackson papers at the Kenan Research Center at the Atlanta History Center and the Graham Washington Jackson Sr. papers at the Auburn Avenue Research Library. Both collections contain many boxes of materials from Graham Jackson's life. There is still so much more to learn about him. Graham Washington Jackson, the Ambassador of Goodwill. Graham Washington Jackson was a man of extraordinary musical talent. He played the accordion, piano, and organ, and he sang. Because of his versatile abilities, Jackson was able to overcome obstacles and become extremely successful as a black man during the time of segregation in the Deep South. My goal in presenting the accomplishments of Graham Jackson is summarized very well in an unidentified newspaper article that ponders why this extraordinary musician has not become a national figure is one of the mysteries of the entertainment world. I think it is important that Jackson is remembered for his success, and I aim to revitalize his name and bring his legacy back into the public eye before it fades completely into obscurity. Born in Portsmouth, Virginia, on February 22, 1903, Jackson was making music in public by the age of 3, playing for a silent theater in Norfolk, Virginia at age 7, and giving concerts by age 14. Soon after he graduated high school in 1923, Jackson joined the Norfolk Metropolitan Band as a piano player. The band was invited to play in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and after that, Jackson traveled to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and worked with the Oka Record Company. So much success came from this opportunity that he was given the chance to play across the country on a tour. The first stop on the tour was Atlanta, Georgia. Jackson fell in love with Atlanta. He moved to Atlanta later that same year, where he worked by giving performances at the Atlanta Royal Theater and serving as orchestra leader at Bailey's 81, a black theater, as well as teaching private lessons in piano, voice, organ, and various other instruments. Not only did Jackson have a rewarding professional life in Atlanta, but he also had a happy personal life. In addition to being a member of the St. Paul of the Cross Catholic Church, he was very involved in the First Congregational Church. On July 2, 1953, Jackson married his wife, Helen Catherine Bolton. The couple had 2 sons, Graham Jackson Jr. and Gerald Wayne Jackson. During his early career, Jackson also pursued a college degree. He attended Morehouse College in Atlanta from 1923 to 1924. Eventually, he chose to move to Chicago, Illinois, where he attended the Chicago Musical College from 1927 until 1929. He also participated in summer sessions at Loyola University in Chicago and Atlanta University in Atlanta from 1927 to 1929, and in a summer session at the Chicago Musical College in 1931. During this time, he was offered and accepted a position as a music teacher at Booker T. Washington High School in Atlanta. While he had not considered teaching music in a public school setting, Jackson saw this as an opportunity to share his knowledge with others. He worked at the high school from 1928 until 1940. In 1940, he once again began to teach studio lessons and returned to performance as a way to make a living. In 1942, Jackson enlisted in the United States Navy and served until 1945 as a chief petty officer. In 1948, he began playing for the WERD radio station in Atlanta. Throughout the next several decades, Jackson served as an entertainer for many people and played at many different events. He continued to give private lessons and play for the WERD radio station. Jackson was also recognized during his career by several Georgia governors. In 1952, Georgia Governor Herman Talmadge appointed Jackson to be the official entertainer to serve the governors of Georgia. In 1970, he became a member of the Georgia Board of Corrections after being appointed by a notoriously racist governor, Lester Maddox. In 1971, Jimmy Carter proclaimed Jackson to be the official musician of the state of Georgia. In 1972, West Georgia College in Carrollton, Georgia, gave Jackson the status of honorary alumnus, signed by the president of the college, Roy Glover, due to his outstanding contribution to music and entertainment and his constructive display of goodwill throughout the world. Jackson died on January 15, 1983, just before his 80th birthday. In 1985, Jackson was posthumously inducted into the Georgia Music Hall of Fame. While inducting Jackson, Lieutenant Governor Zell Miller stated, "The strength of his musical character was built in Georgia. His contributions to the state were immeasurable, and we will long cherish his memory." Despite statements like these, however, Jackson is little remembered in today's world. If someone does encounter Jackson's name, it is probably in the caption of the famous Life magazine cover photo that captured his performance at President Roosevelt's funeral. How did Jackson, a black man during the time of Jim Crow laws in the Deep South, achieve so much success? Making the right connections was vital to his achievements. One example of a high-class connection he made was with Mr. Winthrop Rockefeller. He met Mr. Rockefeller during his time in the Navy when he performed to sell war bonds. Jackson later played for Mr. Rockefeller's niece, Miss Abby Rockefeller Milton, at her debut party. Here, Jackson played hours more than he was originally hired because the attendees enjoyed his music so much. Out of appreciation for his fine entertaining at the party, Rockefeller told Jackson to go out and find a new accordion the next morning. Rockefeller would pay for it. Jackson spent the following day looking through nearly every music shop in New York before finding an instrument that was better than the one he already owned. The instrument that Rockefeller purchased for Jackson was a $1,500 Dolop accordion that was made in Italy. The amount equates to around $20,000 in today's money. Mr. Rockefeller is also quoted to have said, "Having heard Mr. Jackson once, no one could question his technical ability, but this alone could not have won him the place he holds in the hearts of his thousands of friends, ranging from small school children through and including the late President Roosevelt." Another example of Jackson making a vital connection was his relationship with Franklin D. Roosevelt. During a 12-year period, Roosevelt came often to Georgia and stayed in Warm Springs at the Little White House. Jackson often came to the Little White House and played for Roosevelt. In fact, from 1933 until Roosevelt's death in 1945, Jackson played for Roosevelt 24 times. Jackson saw Roosevelt just hours before his death and was shocked when he heard the announcement over the radio, thinking it may have been just part of a radio program rather than reality. Soon after he arrived at his destination, he spoke to a friend and confirmed that Roosevelt was, in fact, dead. Jackson played outside of Georgia Hall as Roosevelt's funeral procession passed by it. It was at this moment that Jackson became a national symbol for the mourning of Roosevelt. The last words that Roosevelt spoke to Jackson were, "So you got here. I'll see you later. I'm going home now." It was because of these words that Jackson chose to play Going Home from the opening section of the second movement of Dvorak's New World Symphony. Hours after the procession had passed, Jackson played anything beautiful that he could think of. As he played, he cried, and a picture of Jackson was taken by photographer Edward Clark that became a cover of Life magazine. This picture is what Graham Jackson is best known for. Even though Jackson was closer to Franklin D. Roosevelt, he continued to correspond with Eleanor Roosevelt throughout her life. During the 1960 presidential campaign, John F. Kennedy met Graham Jackson. Kennedy gave a speech at the Little White House. He chose to talk about reforms he wanted to implement in his presidency, as well as the legacy of Roosevelt. Since Jackson was so close to Roosevelt and performed several times at the Little White House, he was invited to perform the same day as Kennedy's speech. There are photographs of Jackson standing with his accordion just behind Kennedy as he spoke. Jackson interacted with a plethora of important government officials throughout his lifetime, but one example that many may find surprising is his performances for and relationship with Lester Maddox. Maddox was a notoriously racist man who was voted into office as the 75th governor of Georgia in response to desegregation in the South. Maddox had once owned a restaurant and chose to close its doors for good rather than desegregate it. Nevertheless, Maddox was kind to Graham Jackson. He heard him perform several times and actually appointed Jackson to the Board of Corrections in 1969 to serve from 1970 to 1971, making Jackson the first black man to serve in this position or any other major administrative position in the state government. Maddox was not the only Georgia governor to recognize how outstanding Jackson was. On November 30th, 1971, Jimmy Carter gave an official proclamation stating, "Whereas the name of Graham Jackson produces nostalgic gaiety in the hearts of thousands of citizens of the state of Georgia and visitors to our own state, and whereas he has the distinction of being the late President Roosevelt's favorite entertainer at the Little White House at Warm Springs, and whereas Graham Jackson is known throughout the world as one of the greatest accordionists, pianists, and organists of our time, he has made many significant and lasting contributions to contemporary music. Therefore, I, Jimmy Carter, Governor of the State of Georgia, do hereby proclaim that the Honorable Graham Jackson shall henceforth be known as the official musician of the State of Georgia." These examples touch only a few of the connections that Jackson made in his lifetime. He was also the first musician to perform for President Harry S. Truman and performed for Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower and Lyndon B. Johnson. Because of his performances for so many U.S. presidents, he assumed the title Favorite of Presidents, which he printed on his promotional materials and business cards. Of course, Jackson did not only find success in the world of the white, rich, and famous. He was black, and he interacted with black circles of the time as well. One interaction is illustrated by an announcement in the Jackson Advocate on Saturday, June 2nd, 1945. The short article, "Music Festival to Pay Tribute to Mr. Roosevelt," states that Jackson was invited to appear at the 6th Annual Negro Music Festival in Chicago, St. Louis, and Detroit. Jackson was also a long-time and active member of the Kappa Alpha Phi fraternity. Kappa Alpha Phi is a historically black fraternity with goals including to promote spiritual, social, intellectual, and moral welfare of members. In May 1944, Jackson was featured in the Kappa Alpha Phi magazine. The feature included praise from a naval officer, a photo of Jackson in his naval uniform, and a copy of a victory song he had composed for Kappa Alpha Phi. He was awarded a Certificate of Merit for his outstanding acts of achievement in 1949. He also received an honors certificate in 1974 from the Atlanta Alumni Chapter of Kappa Alpha Phi for his 30-plus years of service to the fraternity. In addition to Kappa Alpha Phi, Jackson also interacted with the black community through his music teaching career. Jackson taught at Booker T. Washington High School from 1928 until 1940. Booker T. Washington High School was opened in 1924 and was the first public school for black students in the state of Georgia. The school opened 52 years after the implementation of public schools in Atlanta and remained the only black school in Atlanta until 1947. During Jackson's 12-year career as head of the music department at the school, he made a significant impact. His enormous influence can be witnessed in the career of Rosalind Pope. Pope received the Graham Jackson Award, which was given out each year to an outstanding music student when she graduated from Booker T. Washington High School. Pope went on to receive the 1958-59 Merrill Award, an award given to someone who has made outstanding contributions to liberal arts education. Pope studied music at the Fontainebleau School of Music and the École Normale de Musique in Paris, France, and also once soloed with the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. All that is to say, Jackson influenced a generation of students to pursue their passions and helped cultivate people's love for music. Amazingly, Jackson found time in 1937 to join a committee to contribute to a bulletin, the Guide to Life-Related Teaching in the Negro High Schools of Georgia, as well as a committee in 1938 to contribute to another bulletin, The Open Road, a teacher's guide for child, adult, and community development in Negro elementary schools of Georgia. These bulletins were published in order to suggest to teachers how to best teach students so as to impact them and the community. The bulletins also talked about how to best make students into good citizens of the United States and highlighted major issues that the communities found within the black schools of Georgia. The committees also compiled resources and suggested further readings for other teachers to look at in order to achieve their goals. Jackson sitting on these committees is evidence of him and the administration of Booker T. Washington High School attempting to better the lives of black people in the South. Another way they accomplished this was through community outreach. Jackson performed during his time as a teacher of an extension course in music appreciation. Extension courses were common during this period and consisted of classes meant to interest the local community in new trades or information. This course was a series of concerts that were used to get the community interested in classical and modern music. Throughout the 1930s, Jackson had ample opportunities to interact with the black community through teaching. With the start of World War II, however, Jackson was given opportunities for outreach across racial lines. Jackson was in the Navy from May 16, 1942, until he received an honorable discharge on September 8, 1945. During his short naval career, he held 3 ranks. He was enlisted as a second-class musician and eventually made it to the rank of Chief Specialist. Chief Specialist is no longer a naval rank. It was used during World War II in order to compensate for an influx of new recruits. The modern-day equivalent would be Chief Petty Officer. Over the 3 years of his naval career, Jackson served in Macon and Atlanta, Georgia, and in Baltimore, Maryland. He also traveled often to his birth state, Virginia, to perform for bond-raising events. War bonds and war stamps were integral to the U.S. effort to fund its participation in World War II. War stamps were either sold cheaply, starting off at around 10 cents, or given out at events in order to encourage civilian participation in the war. Once a book of stamps had been collected, it could be traded out for a war bond. War bonds were a way for the government to take money out of circulation in order to avoid inflation. The war bonds were sold at a slightly lower value than what they were worth to incentivize the public to purchase them when they had the financial means to do so. After the war, the bonds could be traded in for their face value.
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Bob's 7th War Loan Hope, telling you to buy those bonds, get that load off your hips, and when the war is over, your pocketbook will be in the chips.
As a musician, Jackson went to parties, recruiting events, concerts, and schools to play music that would elicit patriotism in order to sell war stamps and war bonds. There are several reasons why we know that Jackson was successful in selling war bonds. There are a plethora of letters from those in charge of various functions where Jackson performed. One example of a commendation of Jackson works comes from Ralph A. Long and Ellen S. Murray, sponsors of the Victory Corps of Savannah Street High School. They wrote to Jackson stating that they were thankful for Jackson's assistance at their stamp and bond drive, and that the school children and also the people of community are buying stamps and bonds today as never before. Another letter of praise comes from R.O. Arnold, chairman of bond sales for Newton County Post-American Legion. He sent a letter to Jackson's supervisors stating, "Graham Jackson put on a swell show for us last night. Together, with our advance sales, we finished up the night with $61,625 worth of bonds." Graham made a fine impression on the audience, and the Legion commends his work enthusiastically. In another instance, a war bond show was held that featured performances by the Tuskegee Airmen as well as Jackson. At this show, an estimated $400,000 was raised. In addition to in-person performances for audiences, Jackson also played for various radio shows in an attempt to sell more war bonds. In one instance, Jackson was driven all around Georgia to play at several radio stations during the 6 war bond drive. In a matter of just 3 days, Jackson performed at the Albany radio stations WGPC and WALB, as well as the Thomasville, American Legion program, Waycross, and Augusta radio stations. When he performed at Waycross, they enjoyed his music so much that they extended his airtime an additional 15 minutes. The same thing happened during his Augusta performance, where he got an additional 30 minutes of airtime. During the 3 days of these performances, Jackson also gave additional concerts for the people who lived in those communities. The other main activity Jackson engaged in as chief specialist was to recruit fellow black soldiers from the Atlanta area into the Navy. At his various performances, he not only sold war bonds, but also encouraged young men to enlist in the services. Jackson performed shows especially for recruiting purposes. He did so many of these shows, in fact, that Jackson had to have a telephone installed in his house. It was very urgent, so a man, Lieutenant W.P. Moore, had to write 2 letters to the Southern Bell Telephone and Telegraph Company to stress the importance of Jackson getting a phone in his home. Moore wrote that the reason Jackson had to get a phone installed were that he was always subject to duty every hour and every day of the week, and that recruiting rally arrangements were normally made outside of normal business hours. During and after his naval career, Jackson was recognized for his many achievements. Jackson received 7 naval citations in honor of the large number of people he was able to recruit, as well as his accomplishments in aiding the sale of over $3 million worth of war bonds. He also received a tribute from the Young Men's Christian Association of Portsmouth, where he was raised, to thank him for his service in keeping the morale of the troops high and the civilian population happy. The mayor of Portsmouth wrote a letter of congratulations to Jackson, stating, "Your contribution to brighten the lives of others during the dark years when our country was at war, and the high type of entertainment that you give is compliment to you and is worthy of note." Throughout his career, Jackson reached both the black and white communities through media such as radio and television. Even outside of wartime, Jackson was always playing for a variety of radio stations. The radio station on which Jackson was most regularly heard was the WERD, the first radio station owned and run by black people in Atlanta. Jackson had a daily show on the station from 1948 until 1955. He had a radio loop in his home, which allowed him to broadcast the daily show from his own home rather than traveling to the studio every day. At one point, the Graham Jackson Show was the longest sustained remote radio program in the country. The show ran for 7 years. He was also featured on NBC's radio show Monitor in the January of 1956.
Monitor. 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 2000 hours Greenwich Mean Time. This is Monitor, reporting the nation and the world.
Jackson received the 750 Award from the WSB radio station in 1975. This award is given to an outstanding person that the radio station has reported about. In addition to the radio, Jackson was featured several times in magazines and on television. Jackson was featured at least 9 times in Life magazine. The most famous of these features, of course, is the photo of him crying at Roosevelt's funeral. He was also featured on a few talk shows, including 8 appearances on Dave Garroway's Today Show on NBC and a feature on the Ed Sullivan Show, Toast of the Town. As successful as Jackson was, racism was still a prominent issue throughout his career. Though known as the ambassador of goodwill between races, this did not stop Jackson from experiencing institutional racism. Segregation was a major part of life in the Deep South, and Jackson often had to put on separate concerts for white and black patrons. If the audience included a mix of races, a point was made to keep them separate. According to the think tank's November 6, 1941 publication, on a few occasions, Jackson was made to dress up like, quote, an old-time darky who used to furnish music on the southern plantations before the war. In a letter, the principal from a school where Jackson performed said, "May God bless you and guide you in the fine work you are doing to build a spirit of greater appreciation and love for your race. More men like you would soon solve the race problem." While the first part of this quote seems positive, the second part alludes to a race problem that should have been non-existent. In a letter regarding Jackson written to his military superior, a representative from the 99 Breakfast Club praised him, but consistently referred to him as boy, despite Jackson being in his 40s. In another one of these letters, the Georgia State chairman of the American Legion wrote, "It would have been outstanding for a white man to have performed as he did, but for a Negro, with no decent places to stay or eat as I found the situation to be, it was of course doubly outstanding." These examples go to show that even black people who were accepted into the white world to a greater degree than most were still kept at an arm's length. All in all, Jackson led a fascinating and productive life. Both a great musician and friend to all, Jackson was a light of peace during a time containing tense race relations. He was able to connect with all who heard him and spread his music throughout Atlanta, Georgia, and the United States as a whole. I hope that by putting together his life story here, he can be remembered once again for his amazing accomplishments.